The morning that changed everything. The morning sun peeked through the dense canopy of oak and pine trees, painting dappled patterns of light on the jogging path. It was a serene moment, the kind of morning where the world seemed to exhale in calm contentment. Birds chirped cheerfully, the soft rustle of leaves accompanying their melody. Brianna Carter, a disciplined and resilient FBI agent, often found solace in these early hours. This was her time, a chance to reconnect with herself before facing the whirlwind of high-stakes investigations and dangerous criminals. Brianna was no stranger to challenges. Growing up in Atlanta, she'd learned early on how to navigate the complexities of society as a strong, intelligent black woman. Her journey to becoming an FBI agent hadn't been easy. It required relentless determination, a sharp mind, and unyielding courage. Now, in her early 30s, she had built a reputation as a top agent, known for her ability to dismantle complex cases and confront injustices head-on. But on mornings like these, none of that mattered. All she wanted was a peaceful run to clear her mind. Dressed in a pair of black athletic leggings and a bright green tank top, Brianna tied her shoelaces with care. She adjusted her wireless headphones, the faint sound of her favorite motivational podcast playing as she prepared to jog through her usual route at Whitestone Park. The park was nestled on the outskirts of Atlanta, a sprawling space of greenery, walking trails, and a glimmering lake that reflected the sky like a polished mirror. It was a place where joggers, families, and dog walkers mingled in quiet harmony. As Brianna started her run, her breathing fell into a steady rhythm, matching the tempo of her strides. Each step was a release, a reminder that she was strong, grounded, and capable. She allowed her thoughts to drift, remembering the laugh of a friend she hadn't seen in months, wondering if she'd get time this weekend to call her mom, and mentally preparing for a case review scheduled later that day. It was routine, predictable, and exactly what she needed. But a nagging feeling began to stir in her chest as she rounded a bend in the trail. At first, she dismissed it as nothing, a flicker of paranoia left over from years in law enforcement. Yet, as she ran past a parked police car sitting idly by the side of the path, its darkened windows concealing the occupant inside, the unease grew stronger. She had seen that car before. Not on this morning, but several times in the past few weeks. It was always parked in the same spot, always unmoving. Brianna tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a local officer stationed to keep an eye on the park. It was suburban Atlanta, after all, crime here was more of an abstract fear than a reality. But the way the car sat there, a silent observer in an otherwise lively park, unsettled her. Brianna continued jogging, her pace quickening slightly as she tried to shake the unease. She told herself she was overthinking. After all, wasn't she the one who taught her trainees to trust the facts over gut instincts? But even as she tried to calm herself, she noticed something strange. The police car had started moving, creeping along the paved path that looped through the park. A few minutes later, Brianna felt the sharp crack of a voice behind her, cutting through the tranquil morning. "Hey! You there! Stop right where you are." She turned her head, slowing her pace to see who was shouting. A man emerged from the patrol car, slamming the door shut with unnecessary force. His heavy boots struck the pavement as he strode toward her, his face partially hidden behind aviator sunglasses. His uniform was crisp, the kind of meticulousness that often signaled more pride in authority than in duty. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Brianna asked, pulling out her earbuds. Her tone was calm, but her instincts were on high alert. The man stopped a few feet from her, standing tall with his hands on his hips. His name tag read D. Harrison. His features were sharp, his demeanor radiating a blend of arrogance and hostility. "We got a report about a suspicious person in the area," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "Female. About your age. Athletic build. You match the description." Brianna's brows furrowed. Suspicious person? In a park full of joggers, dog walkers, and families? I'm just out for a run, she said, keeping her voice even. Like everyone else here. Yeah. Officer Harrison retorted. Then you won't mind showing me some ID. Brianna sighed. She knew the drill. But she also knew her rights. I don't have ID on me. I'm jogging. Is there a specific reason you're stopping me? Harrison's expression hardened. He took a step closer, his presence invading her personal space. You fit the description I was given, he said again, his tone more menacing this time. So I suggest you cooperate before things get difficult. Brianna stood her ground, her mind racing. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered someone trying to abuse their authority. She had faced worse threats in her line of work. But the way Harrison's eyes lingered on her, the subtle sneer in his voice, made her skin crawl. This wasn't about procedure, it was about power. Officer, with all due respect, I haven't done anything wrong, Brianna said, her voice firm but polite. I'm not obligated to carry ID while jogging, and you haven't given me a valid reason for stopping me. If this is just a misunderstanding, I'd like to continue my run. Harrison's jaw tightened. The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of nearby parkgoers. A young man walking his dog paused, pulling out his phone to film the interaction. Brianna noticed the bystander but kept her focus on Harrison. You think this is a joke? Harrison snapped. He reached out and pointed a finger inches from her face. You don't get to decide when this ends. I'm giving you a lawful order, show me your ID or I'll take you in. Brianna felt a surge of anger but forced herself to remain composed. She wasn't about to let this man intimidate her. Slowly, she pulled her phone from her armband, unlocking the screen. If you're going to escalate this, I have every right to document it, she said. That was the moment everything changed. Harrison's face twisted in fury. Oh, so you think recording me will scare me? Give me that. He lunged forward, kicking the phone out of her hand with a swift motion. It clattered to the pavement, the screen cracking on impact. A collective gasp rose from the small crowd that had gathered. Brianna stared at her phone, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She took a deep breath, her mind racing as she weighed her next move. Harrison stood tall, his chest puffed out in triumph. You're done, he said. Pick up your phone and leave. Now. Brianna bent down to retrieve her phone, her fingers curling around the shattered device. As she stood, she locked eyes with Harrison, her expression unreadable. And then, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her FBI badge. I think you're the one who's done, she said, her voice steady but cold. You just assaulted a federal agent. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Phones were now pointed directly at Harrison, capturing every detail of his shocked expression. His face turned pale, the color draining as he realized the gravity of what he had just done. Brianna held her badge up, letting the sunlight catch the gleaming emblem. Now, she said, her voice cutting through the growing noise, let's talk about abuse of power. The balance of power shifts. The air around them was heavy with silence, broken only by the murmurs of the crowd and the rustling leaves in the wind. Officer Derek Harrison stared at the badge in Brianna Carter's hand, his expression frozen in disbelief. The weight of the golden shield glinting in the sunlight seemed to crush the arrogant stance he had carried moments before. It was a moment of reckoning, one that had shifted the power dynamic in a way Harrison could have never anticipated. What is this? Harrison finally croaked, his voice a shadow of its former bravado. He squinted at the badge, as though willing it to vanish or reveal itself as counterfeit. But the longer he stared, the clearer it became, the badge was real. Brianna held it steady, her fingers firm as if the badge itself carried the authority of every federal law she had sworn to uphold. Special Agent Brianna Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation, she said, her voice cutting through the tense air like a blade. And I'll repeat, you just assaulted a federal agent. That's a serious crime, Officer Harrison. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, shifting from confusion to outrage. Phones pointed directly at Harrison, their owners no longer just passive observers but witnesses capturing a moment of blatant abuse of power. Live-streaming comments flooded the screens of several onlookers. "Did y'all see that? He kicked her phone, she's an FBI agent. This dude's career is done. Finally, someone standing up to these bullies." Harrison's jaw clenched as his eyes darted to the growing crowd. His usual tactics of intimidation wouldn't work here, he was no longer in control. His hand moved to his radio, his fingers gripping it tightly as he tried to salvage the situation. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Harrison said, attempting to regain his composure. "You might be FBI, but you're still subject to local law enforcement procedures. This isn't about your badge, it's about your behavior." Brianna raised an eyebrow, the slightest hint of a smirk tugging at her lips. "Behavior? You're accusing me of misconduct after what you just did?" "This is not about my behavior, officer, it's about yours. You've overstepped your authority, assaulted a citizen, an agent, no less, and now you're trying to deflect. That won't work." The sharpness of her words struck Harrison like a physical blow. His arrogance faltered, his breathing uneven as the crowd closed in further. The weight of accountability bore down on him, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly exposed. Still, he couldn't let go of his pride. "I was doing my job," he snapped. "We had reports of suspicious activity. I acted accordingly. If you just cooperated." "If I'd cooperated?" Brianna cut him off, her tone steady but cutting. She took a step closer, her badge still prominently displayed. "I complied with every lawful request. I answered your questions. I stood my ground when you couldn't provide a valid reason for detaining me. And when I exercised my constitutional right to record our interaction, you escalated. Let's not rewrite history." The tension was palpable. Harrison glanced around, seeking an escape, but the cameras, the onlookers, and the weight of the moment held him captive. A voice from the crowd broke the silence, a young man with a phone raised high. "So what happens now? Does he get arrested for what he just did?" The question hung in the air, resonating with everyone present. Brianna didn't flinch. She turned to the man, her gaze softening slightly. "Justice will take its course," she said, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "That's what we're here to ensure." Her words landed like a hammer. Justice. It was a concept Harrison had wielded carelessly, but now it had turned against him. The crowd murmured in agreement, their phones still trained on the two figures standing at the center of the standoff. But Harrison wasn't ready to back down, not entirely. "You think flashing that badge means you're untouchable?" he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You don't scare me." Brianna's gaze hardened, her posture unwavering. "I don't need to scare you, officer. The law will handle that." Harrison took a step back, his hand still gripping his radio. He hesitated, then spoke into it, his voice shaky. "Dispatch, this is Officer Harrison. I need backup at Whitestone Park. Possible, situation involving a federal agent." The crowd erupted in incredulous whispers. "Backup? He's calling for backup now?" "Yeah, because that's gonna save him. Dude's just digging himself a deeper hole." Brianna crossed her arms, her badge still visible. "Calling backup to handle a situation you created? Bold move," she said, her voice tinged with irony. "I'll wait. But I'll also be calling my superiors. Let's see who gets here first." Harrison's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to respond, but a voice behind him interrupted. "Officer Harrison, what's going on here?" A second officer had arrived on the scene, his expression one of confusion mixed with concern. He was younger, his demeanor less confrontational. His badge read M. Daniels. He glanced at the crowd, then at Brianna, before looking back at Harrison. I had it under control, Harrison snapped, his irritation barely masking his panic. Daniels raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Under control? Looks like half the park is recording you, and she's holding an FBI badge. He turned to Brianna. Ma'am, I'm Officer Daniels. Can you explain what's going on? Brianna exhaled, finally sensing a sliver of professionalism. Officer Daniels, I'm Special Agent Brianna Carter with the FBI. Your colleague here stopped me without cause, escalated the situation unnecessarily, and physically knocked my phone out of my hand. That phone, by the way, was recording his conduct. Daniel's eyes widened as he processed her words. He glanced at Harrison, his expression turning more critical. Is this true? She resisted my instructions. Harrison blurted, his tone defensive. She was acting suspicious. That's enough, Daniels said sharply, cutting him off. This doesn't look good, Harrison. Not at all. Daniels turned back to Brianna. Agent Carter, I sincerely apologize for the actions of my colleague. This isn't how we conduct ourselves. I'll ensure this incident is properly documented. Brianna nodded. I appreciate that, Officer Daniels. But I'll be documenting it myself, and I expect full cooperation from your department. Daniels nodded, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. Understood. I'll notify the watch commander immediately. Harrison's face contorted in anger and frustration. You're taking her side. I'm taking the side of the law, Daniels snapped. And right now, it doesn't look like you are. The crowd erupted in murmurs again, the tide of public opinion now squarely against Harrison. Live-stream comments were flying in. Officer Daniels for the win. Finally, someone who knows how to do their job. Harrison's done. Pack it up. Brianna watched as Harrison's bravado crumbled. His shoulders slumped, his hands fidgeting nervously. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of his actions. I'll be filing a formal complaint, Brianna said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of finality. And trust me, this will not end here. Daniels nodded again. Understood, Agent Carter. I'll ensure the complaint is logged and handled appropriately. As the crowd began to disperse, the gravity of the moment lingered. Brianna knew this was only the beginning. The fight for accountability had just begun, and she was determined to see it through. Harrison, meanwhile, stood in stunned silence, the badge she had shown him etched into his mind like a scar. The ripple effect. The incident at Whitestone Park might have ended in the moment, but the consequences of Officer Derek Harrison's actions were only just beginning to unravel. By the time Brianna Carter returned home that afternoon, her phone was vibrating relentlessly. Texts, emails, and calls flooded in as the footage of the encounter spread across social media. The video had already gone viral. The hashtags #JusticeForBrianna and #AccountabilityNow were trending nationwide. News outlets picked up the story within hours, plastering headlines that captured the public's fury in demand for answers. Police officer assaults FBI agent in public park, abuse of power caught on camera. FBI agent stands her ground against rogue cop. Officer Derek Harrison under fire for disrespecting the badge. Brianna sat in her modest apartment, staring at her cracked phone screen. She had sent a quick email to her FBI supervisor, detailing the incident and attaching the video she managed to recover from the damaged device. The agency moved swiftly, her supervisor, Assistant Director Paul Greer, called within minutes. Agent Carter, Greer said, his tone measured but tinged with concern. I've reviewed your report and seen the footage. First of all, are you all right? Brianna nodded, though he couldn't see her. I'm fine, sir. Just frustrated that it happened. Understandable, Greer said. You handled yourself impeccably. I want you to know that the Bureau stands behind you. We're initiating a formal complaint against Officer Harrison with the Atlanta Police Department. This kind of behavior cannot and will not be tolerated. Brianna exhaled, grateful for the support but knowing the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Thank you, sir. I just want to make sure this doesn't get buried. It won't, Greer assured her. But you should also prepare yourself. These things have a way of becoming messy. The public reaction is strong, and APD won't have a choice but to act. Harrison will be placed under investigation, but that might not stop him or his allies from trying to discredit you. Stay sharp. The warning lingered in Brianna's mind long after the call ended. She had always known that standing up to injustice came with risks, but hearing it from someone as seasoned as Greer made it feel more immediate, more personal. The fallout begins. Meanwhile, at the Atlanta Police Department, chaos was unfolding. Officer Harrison sat in a small, dimly lit conference room, his face pale and his hands trembling as he tried to compose himself. Across the table sat his immediate superior, Captain Laura Morales, a no-nonsense leader with little tolerance for scandal. "What were you thinking, Derek?" Morales demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through his excuses before they could form. "Do you have any idea what kind of storm you've brought down on this department?" Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Captain, it wasn't what it looked like." She was being defiant, and I. "Stop," Morales interrupted, holding up a hand. "I've seen the footage. Everyone's seen the footage. You didn't just overstep, you stomped all over protocol and basic decency. You kicked an FBI agent's phone to the ground in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses. What the hell were you thinking?" "I didn't know she was FBI," Harrison muttered, his voice defensive. "She was acting suspicious. I was doing my job." Morales leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Your job is to protect and serve, not intimidate and assault. And now the entire city, no, the entire country, is watching us because of your ego. Do you know how many complaints I've already received this morning?" Harrison looked away, his jaw tightening. "I can handle it." "No, you can't," Morales snapped. "This isn't something you can just sweep under the rug. Internal Affairs is launching an investigation, effective immediately. And as of now, you're suspended without pay." Harrison's head shot up. "Suspended? Captain, you can't." "I can, and I have to," Morales said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You've put this entire department in jeopardy. The mayor's office is breathing down my neck, civil rights groups are demanding accountability, and half of Atlanta is ready to march in the streets. If it were up to me, you'd already be out of a job." Harrison's face turned red, a mix of anger and humiliation burning in his chest. But he couldn't argue. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, he realized just how much trouble he was in. Brianna faces the public. As the days passed, Brianna found herself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. She had never sought fame or attention, but the incident had made her a symbol of resistance against abuse of power. Invitations poured in from media outlets, civil rights organizations, and even community leaders eager to amplify her story. Reluctantly, she agreed to an interview with one of the nation's leading journalists, Monica Reyes. The sit-down took place in a quiet studio, the backdrop simple and understated to keep the focus on Brianna's words. Reyes leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Agent Carter, first of all, thank you for joining us. I know this must be a challenging time for you." Brianna nodded. "It is, but it's also an opportunity to address a much bigger issue." "Let's start with the incident itself," Reyes said. "When Officer Harrison approached you, did you expect things to escalate the way they did?" "Not at all," Brianna replied. "I was just out for a run, trying to clear my head before a busy day. But the moment he stopped me, I felt something was off. He wasn't asking questions to gather information, he was making accusations, trying to assert control. And when I asserted my rights, he responded with aggression." Reyes nodded. Your composure during the encounter has been widely praised. What was going through your mind when you decided to show him your badge? Brianna paused, choosing her words carefully. Honestly, I didn't want to escalate the situation. But I also knew I couldn't back down. It wasn't just about me, it was about every person who's ever been harassed or mistreated by someone abusing their authority. Showing my badge was a way to remind him that no one is above accountability, not even him. The interview continued, touching on themes of systemic reform, accountability, and the importance of standing up for one's rights. By the time it aired, the public response was overwhelming. Brianna's story resonated with millions, sparking a nationwide conversation about policing, racial bias, and the need for systemic change. Harrison's reckoning. For Derek Harrison, life as he knew it was crumbling. The investigation by Internal Affairs moved quickly, fueled by public outrage and the undeniable evidence captured on video. Witnesses from the park were interviewed, their accounts painting a damning picture of Harrison's behavior. Even his colleagues began to distance themselves. Once a respected, if heavy-handed, officer, Harrison now found himself isolated, a pariah in the very department he had once considered his domain. One afternoon, as Harrison sat in his sparsely furnished apartment, he received a letter from the Civilian Review Board. The contents were clear, a formal hearing had been scheduled, and his actions were under scrutiny not just from the department but from the city itself. For the first time, Harrison felt the full weight of his decisions. This wasn't just about losing his job, it was about the legacy he had tarnished, the lives he had impacted, and the irreversible damage to his reputation. And deep down, he knew there was no escaping the consequences. A movement ignited. Back in her apartment, Brianna reflected on the whirlwind of events. She didn't want to be a hero, she just wanted to do her job, to live her life with dignity and respect. But as she scrolled through messages of support and solidarity from strangers around the world, she realized that this was bigger than her. The incident at Whitestone Park had sparked something larger, a movement demanding accountability, justice, and change. And though the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, Brianna was ready to walk it. Because standing up to injustice wasn't just her duty as an FBI agent, it was her responsibility as a human being. The turning tide. The morning of the Civilian Review Board hearing arrived with an eerie calm that belied the storm brewing outside. At the heart of downtown Atlanta, City Hall was a hive of activity. Media vans lined the streets, their antennas pointing skyward like accusing fingers. Protesters gathered in droves, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability over authority." Chants echoed through the air, a unified voice demanding change. Inside, the marble hallways of the municipal building were equally tense. Brianna Carter sat in a private waiting room, dressed in a tailored black blazer and slacks that mirrored her composed demeanor. Her badge rested in her pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the responsibility she carried, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice at the hands of those sworn to protect. Across the hall, Officer Derek Harrison waited in a separate room, his face pale and drawn. He looked out of place without his uniform, dressed instead in a rumpled suit that seemed to hang awkwardly on his broad frame. His lawyer, a stern man with gray hair and a sharp jawline, whispered to him urgently, but Harrison barely registered the words. His mind was a cacophony of doubts and fears. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, a guardian of order. But now, he stood on the precipice of his own undoing. The hearing begins. The hearing room was packed. Members of the Civilian Review Board, a diverse panel of community leaders, legal experts, and activists, sat behind a long wooden table at the front. The audience was filled with reporters, community advocates, and ordinary citizens eager to witness the proceedings. Cameras were strictly prohibited inside, but the world outside would soon know every detail. Brianna entered first, her footsteps measured and deliberate. As she took her seat, she felt the weight of the room's eyes on her but refused to be unnerved. She had faced dangerous criminals, high-stakes negotiations, and life-threatening situations. This was different, but no less critical. Moments later, Harrison walked in with his lawyer. The murmurs in the room grew louder. His once confident swagger was gone, replaced by the uneasy gait of a man whose arrogance had crumbled under the weight of his actions. He avoided eye contact with Brianna as he took his seat across the room. The chairperson, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Renee Caldwell, banged her gavel to bring the room to order. This hearing is convened to address the complaint brought against Officer Derek Harrison of the Atlanta Police Department. We will review the evidence, hear testimony, and determine the appropriate course of action. Let us proceed. Brianna's testimony. Brianna was the first to testify. She walked to the podium with steady confidence, her every movement deliberate. She had spent the past week reviewing every detail of the incident, preparing for this moment. The stakes were too high for anything less than perfection. Special Agent Carter, Dr. Caldwell began, her tone professional yet empathetic, please recount the events of that morning. Brianna took a deep breath and began. On the morning in question, I was jogging in Whitestone Park, a place I frequent for exercise. I was approached by Officer Harrison, who claimed I matched the description of a suspicious person. I complied with his initial inquiries but questioned the validity of his reasons for detaining me further. When I began recording the interaction, within my legal rights, Officer Harrison kicked my phone to the ground, damaging it. At that point, I identified myself as an FBI agent and informed him of his actions' legal ramifications. Her voice was steady, unwavering, as she continued. This was not a case of an officer performing his duty. This was an abuse of authority, an attempt to intimidate and control without cause. The situation only escalated because I refused to submit to unwarranted demands. As she spoke, members of the board nodded slightly, their expressions ranging from attentive to visibly disturbed. When she finished, Dr. Caldwell leaned forward. Agent Carter, she said, in your opinion, did Officer Harrison's actions reflect any form of bias or prejudice? Brianna hesitated for a fraction of a second, choosing her words carefully. I can't speak to his intentions, but I can speak to his actions. He targeted me in a public park, surrounded by other individuals, for no discernible reason. When I asserted my rights, his behavior became aggressive. Whether it was racial bias, gender bias, or another form of prejudice, his actions betrayed the principles of law enforcement. Her response resonated with the room, sparking murmurs of agreement. Brianna returned to her seat, her testimony a powerful indictment against Harrison's conduct. Harrison's defense. Harrison's lawyer approached the podium next, his demeanor calculated and calm. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, what we have here is a misunderstanding. My client, Officer Harrison, was responding to a report of suspicious activity. His actions, while regrettable, were not malicious. They were the result of heightened vigilance in a public setting. He paused, letting his words settle. Officer Harrison has served this city for over 15 years with distinction. This incident does not define him. It is an anomaly in an otherwise exemplary career. The lawyer's words were met with skeptical glances from the board. Then Harrison himself was called to testify. He approached the podium reluctantly, his movements stiff and mechanical. Officer Harrison, Dr. Caldwell began, her tone sharp, please explain your conduct that morning. Harrison cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. I thought I was following protocol. The report said there was a suspicious individual in the area. Agent Carter matched the description, and he faltered, the weight of his own excuses collapsing under the scrutiny of the room. I reacted poorly. I regret my actions. Poorly. Dr. Caldwell repeated, raising an eyebrow. Officer, you didn't just act poorly, you violated the rights of a federal agent. Can you explain why you felt it was necessary to escalate the situation? Harrison's jaw tightened. She was uncooperative. Dr. Caldwell leaned forward. Uncooperative? Or unwilling to submit to unjust demands? The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison's lawyer quickly interjected, attempting to redirect the narrative, but the damage was done. Harrison's weak testimony only solidified the perception that his actions were indefensible. The crowd reacts. Outside City Hall, the crowd waited anxiously for news. Protesters chanted slogans demanding justice, their voices blending into a symphony of determination. Onlookers debated passionately, some defending law enforcement, others decrying its abuses. News anchors reported live, speculating on the hearing's outcome. One anchor summarized the mood succinctly: "This case has become a flashpoint for broader issues of police accountability. No matter the decision, it's clear that the public demands change." The decision. Hours later, the board reconvened to deliver its verdict. The room was silent as Dr. Caldwell addressed the audience. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony, the board has determined that Officer Derek Harrison's actions were a clear abuse of authority and a violation of department protocols. We recommend immediate termination of his employment and referral of this case to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges. A collective exhale swept through the room, followed by a ripple of quiet applause. Brianna closed her eyes briefly, relief washing over her. Justice, at least in part, had been served. Harrison's face was a mask of disbelief and anger as he stormed out of the room, trailed by his lawyer. His downfall was complete. A new beginning. For Brianna, the hearing was only one step in a larger fight. The incident had ignited a national conversation, one that she was determined to help shape. She began collaborating with civil rights organizations, advocating for policy reforms, and using her platform to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. This was no longer just her story, it was a movement. And Brianna, with her unwavering resolve, was ready to lead it forward. Building the movement. In the weeks following the Civilian Review Board's decision to terminate Officer Derek Harrison and recommend criminal charges, the ripple effects of the Whitestone Park incident continued to grow. The viral video of the encounter had sparked a national conversation, but for Brianna Carter, it was only the beginning of a much larger fight. She knew this wasn't just about her, it was about dismantling a system that allowed people like Harrison to thrive unchecked. Brianna sat in her small home office, her desk cluttered with notes, legal briefs, and articles on police reform. The soft hum of her laptop filled the room as she scrolled through the endless stream of emails and messages flooding her inbox. Activists, civil rights organizations, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens had reached out, all offering support or asking for guidance. Brianna felt the weight of their hopes and expectations pressing down on her. She had always been a private person. Even as an FBI agent, her work had largely been behind the scenes, methodical and precise. Now, she was thrust into the public eye, her name and face becoming synonymous with accountability and courage. It was a role she hadn't asked for but one she couldn't walk away from. A call to action. Late one evening, Brianna received a call from Dr. Renee Caldwell, the chair of the Civilian Review Board. Though the hearing was over, the two had stayed in touch, bonded by a shared commitment to justice. "Agent Carter," Dr. Caldwell said, her voice warm but firm. "I've been following the aftermath of your case closely. The public response has been overwhelming, but we both know that public outrage isn't enough. We need to channel this energy into something lasting." "I agree," Brianna replied. "But where do we start? The problems run so deep, it feels overwhelming." "We start where we are," Caldwell said. "You have a voice now, one that people are listening to. If you're willing, I'd like to propose something, a joint initiative to push for meaningful police reform, starting with policy changes right here in Atlanta." Brianna leaned back in her chair, the idea taking shape in her mind. "I'm in. What do you have in mind?" Caldwell outlined the plan: a series of town halls to engage the community, a campaign to pressure local lawmakers into passing stronger accountability measures, and a coalition of advocates to address systemic issues within the police department. It was ambitious, but Brianna felt a surge of determination. This was her chance to make a real difference. The first town hall. The first town hall was held in a community center in downtown Atlanta. The room was packed, with standing room only, as people of all backgrounds came to share their stories and listen to Brianna speak. The atmosphere buzzed with a mix of hope and frustration, the collective energy of a community ready for change. Brianna stood at the front of the room, flanked by Dr. Caldwell and a panel of local leaders. As she approached the microphone, the room fell silent, all eyes on her. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady but heartfelt. "I want to start by thanking all of you for being here. What happened to me at Whitestone Park was just one example of a much larger problem. Too many people, particularly in Black and brown communities, face harassment, discrimination, and abuse of power from those sworn to protect us. It has to stop." She paused, scanning the crowd. But change doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when communities come together, when voices rise in unison, demanding something better. That's why we're here tonight, not just to talk about what's wrong, but to build a vision for what's possible. The room erupted in applause, the sound echoing off the walls. For the next 2 hours, Brianna listened as community members shared their experiences, stories of unjust arrests, racial profiling, and encounters with officers who viewed them as threats rather than citizens. Each story was a reminder of the systemic change that was needed, and Brianna made sure every voice was heard. As the event wrapped up, a young woman approached Brianna, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you for standing up," she said. "People like me, we've been ignored for so long. You've given us hope." Brianna placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. "This isn't just my fight, it's ours. And together, we're going to make them listen." The coalition takes shape. Over the next few months, Brianna and Dr. Caldwell worked tirelessly to build their coalition, which they called ACT, Accountability, Community, and Transparency. The coalition quickly gained momentum, drawing support from advocacy groups, faith leaders, local businesses, and even a few reform-minded police officers. ACT's mission was clear: to push for reforms that would hold law enforcement accountable, rebuild trust between communities and police, and ensure transparency in all aspects of policing. Their first major campaign focused on 3 key demands. Independent oversight, the establishment of an independent body to investigate complaints against law enforcement, with the power to enforce disciplinary actions. Body camera accountability, mandatory use of body cameras for all officers, with strict penalties for tampering or failing to record interactions. Bias training and recruitment reform, comprehensive training to address racial bias and systemic prejudice, coupled with recruitment strategies to diversify police forces. As ACT gained traction, Brianna found herself juggling multiple roles: advocate, strategist, and public speaker. She appeared on national news programs, gave interviews to major publications, and even testified before the Georgia state legislature. Each time, she spoke with clarity and conviction, using her own experience to highlight the urgent need for change. Resistance and challenges. Not everyone welcomed the movement with open arms. Law enforcement unions pushed back hard, accusing ACT of being anti-police and undermining officer morale. Conservative media outlets framed Brianna as a radical, portraying her as a threat to public safety. The backlash didn't stop at words. Brianna began receiving anonymous threats, emails and letters warning her to back off or face the consequences. At times, the pressure was overwhelming. Late at night, she would sit in her apartment, the weight of it all pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. But each time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of the people she was fighting for: the young woman at the town hall, the families who had lost loved ones to police violence, the countless individuals who had been silenced for too long. They were her strength, her reason to keep going. A landmark victory. 6 months after its founding, ACT achieved its first major victory. The Atlanta City Council voted unanimously to establish the Independent Police Accountability Board, a civilian-led body with investigative powers. It was a hard-fought win, the result of relentless advocacy, community organizing, and public pressure. The night of the vote, Brianna stood outside City Hall with hundreds of supporters, the air electric with celebration. As the news broke, cheers erupted, and people embraced one another. For many, it was the first time they felt truly heard. Dr. Caldwell turned to Brianna, her eyes shining with pride. "This is just the beginning," she said. Brianna nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I know. But it's a good start. Moving forward." The victory in Atlanta sent ripples across the nation, inspiring similar efforts in other cities. Brianna continued her work with ACT, traveling to communities across the country to share her story and support grassroots movements. Each step was a reminder that change, though difficult, was possible. For Brianna, the Whitestone Park incident was no longer just a memory of injustice, it was the catalyst for something far greater. She had taken the worst moment of her life and turned it into a force for good, proving that even in the face of adversity, one person could make a difference. And as she looked toward the future, she knew the fight was far from over. But she also knew she wasn't alone. Together, they were building a world where justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a reality. Legacy of change. A year after the Whitestone Park incident, Brianna Carter stood on a podium beneath the bright Atlanta sun. Around her, a massive crowd gathered in Liberty Square, a diverse sea of faces unified by one purpose, celebrating the official launch of the National Coalition for Justice and Reform, NCJR, the movement Brianna had co-founded. The coalition was the culmination of a year's work, town halls, advocacy campaigns, legislative battles, and countless hours of relentless effort. Brianna adjusted the microphone as the crowd quieted, their anticipation palpable. Behind her, banners displayed the coalition's mission statement: justice, accountability, equality. For Brianna, those words weren't just slogans, they were a promise to a nation grappling with the deep scars of systemic injustice. She began, her voice steady but brimming with emotion. "1 year ago, I was just a jogger in a park. 1 year ago, I faced a moment of injustice that could have broken me. But instead, it lit a fire that all of you helped fuel. Today, we stand here, not just to celebrate how far we've come, but to recommit ourselves to the work ahead." The crowd erupted into applause, but Brianna raised her hand gently to quiet them. She wasn't finished. "This coalition isn't about me," she continued. "It's about the mother who lost her son to senseless violence. It's about the young man who fears the very people sworn to protect him. It's about every single person who's been silenced, ignored, or dehumanized by a system that values power over justice. This is their platform. Their movement. And it belongs to all of us." A movement takes root. The NCJR quickly gained national traction, drawing support from a broad coalition of activists, legal experts, community leaders, and everyday citizens. Its mission was ambitious: to address systemic inequities in policing, judicial processes, and incarceration while promoting community-led safety initiatives. Brianna and her team divided their efforts into 3 key pillars. Policy advocacy. The NCJR drafted and championed legislation aimed at nationwide police reform, including the establishment of independent oversight boards, mandatory body camera policies, and stringent accountability measures for officers found guilty of misconduct. Community empowerment. The coalition launched grassroots programs to educate communities on their rights, provide resources for victims of police violence, and fund community-driven alternatives to traditional policing. Cultural change. Recognizing that systemic change required a cultural shift, the NCJR partnered with media outlets, artists, and educators to reshape public narratives around justice and accountability. One of the coalition's most notable successes came 6 months after its launch, when Congress passed the Federal Police Accountability and Transparency Act, a landmark piece of legislation inspired in part by the public outcry following Brianna's case. The law mandated independent investigations into police misconduct, created a national database of officers with substantiated complaints, and allocated funding for community safety initiatives. For Brianna, seeing the bill signed into law was surreal. As she stood in the rose garden of the White House during the signing ceremony, she felt a wave of pride and responsibility. This was proof that change was possible, but it was also a reminder of the work still left to do. Personal sacrifices. Behind the scenes, Brianna's journey was far from easy. The pressures of leading a national movement often felt insurmountable. She found herself working 16-hour days, juggling media appearances, strategic planning, and personal outreach to those affected by injustice. The constant demands took a toll on her personal life. Her once close relationship with her mother became strained. "Brianna," her mother said during one emotional phone call, "I'm proud of you. But I worry about you too. You can't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." "I know, Mom," Brianna replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "But this fight is too important to stop now." Even her friendship suffered. Her best friend, Alicia, tried to be supportive, but Brianna's relentless schedule often left little time for personal connections. "I just miss you," Alicia admitted one evening over a rare dinner together. The Brianna who used to laugh, relax, and actually take a break. Brianna sighed, guilt gnawing at her. "I miss her too," she admitted. But she couldn't shake the feeling that every moment spent resting was a moment lost in the fight for justice. Confronting opposition. As the NCJR grew in influence, so did the backlash. Conservative media outlets continued to vilify Brianna, labeling her a radical, intent on dismantling law enforcement. Law enforcement unions across the country pushed back against NCJR policies, arguing they undermined police morale and put officers at greater risk. The threats against Brianna escalated as well. Anonymous emails and letters flooded her inbox, some containing graphic threats of violence. Her apartment was vandalized one night, the words, "Back off," spray-painted across her front door. The FBI quickly stepped in to provide security, but the experience left her shaken. During a live television interview, a host grilled her about the opposition. "Agent Carter, many believe your movement is anti-police and that your policies make it harder for officers to do their jobs. What do you say to that?" Brianna's response was measured but firm. "This movement isn't anti-police, it's pro-justice. Accountability doesn't weaken law enforcement, it strengthens it. The goal isn't to punish good officers, but to ensure that bad actors can't tarnish the badge or harm the communities they serve." Her words resonated with many, but the attacks continued. Still, Brianna refused to back down. "If they're coming for me," she told her team one day, "it means we're making an impact." Healing and hope. Despite the challenges, there were moments of profound healing and hope. One such moment came during an NCJR-sponsored community event in Whitestone Park, the very place where Brianna's ordeal began. Hundreds gathered to celebrate the progress made since that fateful day, their joy a stark contrast to the tension that had once filled the park. Brianna stood near the lake, watching as children played and families picnicked. An older woman approached her, a gentle smile on her face. "You don't know me, but I wanted to thank you," the woman said. "My grandson was harassed by the police last year, and for a long time, he thought no one cared. But then he saw you stand up, and it gave him hope. It gave all of us hope." Brianna felt tears prick her eyes as she shook the woman's hand. Moments like this reminded her why she fought so hard. A lasting legacy. By the end of its first year, the NCJR had made significant strides. Police reform bills were introduced in multiple states, community safety programs flourished, and public awareness of systemic issues reached new heights. Brianna, though exhausted, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. During an interview commemorating the anniversary of the movement, she was asked, "What's next for Brianna Carter?" She smiled thoughtfully. What's next is continuing the fight. Progress doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen alone. This movement is bigger than me, and it's bigger than any one person. But together, we can create a future where justice isn't just an ideal, it's a reality for everyone. The journey forward. As Brianna walked off the stage at the Liberty Square event, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was ready. The movement she had helped build was strong, fueled by the voices of those who demanded better. And as she looked out at the crowd one last time, she knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't stop until justice prevailed. The fight wasn't over. But it was worth every step.